You know I wasn't there, right? I had no intention of visiting, even before that bastard Mooney was in prison. Sure, you could say I met Mooney. Encountered him would be more appropriate. Mad Dog, they called him, right? Jimmy told me that. Have you ever seen him? In the flesh, I mean. Everyone saw the mugshot in the newspapers. Ugly son of a bitch, wasn't he? That scar running down his forehead and over his eye socket. His right eye all cloudy, grey and fucked up. God knows why he didn't get an eye patch, or get it removed and replaced with a glass one. That's what I did. You might think he looked scary in those photos, but that's nothing compared to seeing the man for real. They say there's a monster inside all of us. With Mooney, that monster was well and truly out. Mad Dog Mooney was a ghost story, a legend that spooked even the most hardened of criminals, but when he came to Darkdale Prison, he proved all too real. The inmates were shell-shocked by his arrival, and rumours persisted of his strange behaviour, whilst accusations from the media of cannibalism were not forgotten. As tensions grew amongst the prison population, a jailbreak was planned to take place under the ethereal glow of a full moon. Mad Dog is an oral history, a compilation of testimonies from witnesses to the atrocity that befell Darkdale Prison. Mad Dog was written by J.R. Park and published by the Sinister Horror Company in 2017. In this episode of Sinister Reread, Kit Power chats with the author about one of the publisher's most talked about titles.
Hello and welcome to Sinister Reread. I am not your host, Justin Park. I am in fact Kit Power, author of two titles with Sinister Horror Company, God Bomb and Breaking Point, neither of which I am here to talk to you about tonight. No, tonight I'm turning the tables on our good man Justin Park because he's written some pretty fantastic books. Among them, one of my favourite werewolf stories of all time, a story called Mad Dog. So in a bid to get to the bottom of what inspired this incredible story and to get under the hood of his writing process, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you your normal host, Justin Park. Justin, how you doing, my man?
Yeah, I'm good, Kit. I'm good. You keeping well?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. You know, keeping busy. I think it's fair to say. So, let's just get into it, man. I want to talk to you about Mad Dog because this book, I vividly remember my first read of this book and how it just absolutely blew my head off. And I reread it this week in preparation for this conversation because I knew I wanted to talk to you about it, and it blew my head off all over again. Let's start with, I'm really interested. There's a lot of stuff I want to get into with you. I want to get into you because this book is really interesting formally. It's really interesting structurally. The pacing is insane, and we've got to get into that. But I'd really like to start, if we can, with I know it's a bit of a chestnut question, but like, can you remember anything about the origins of this, where the bones of this idea came from? Because I think it's a unique idea, actually.
So the initial idea that came with Mad Dog was a book that actually appeared with a cover before an actual story. So the Sinister Horror Company had been going for probably no more than a couple of months. And the guy who does a lot of our covers and designed the logo, Vincent Hunt, is fantastic artist and graphic designer. And he produced a book cover, which is the Mad Dog cover that you kind of see now. Only it wasn't with my name on it. It was with another guy's name on it because he was a friend of Dan Chant, who used to be in Sinister Horror Company with me. And he had this idea of doing this werewolf book set against the backdrop of the IRA and wanted to call it Mad Dog.
Okay.
So Vince had knocked up this cover, or a version of it, slightly different, but pretty much the same. And I looked at it and I loved it. Now, I love werewolves, werewolf movies and werewolf things. One of my favorite kind of horror sort of standard monsters, as it were. It goes all the way back to first being exposed to Michael Jackson's Thriller when I was a kid.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So I think that, I mean, you know, the scene where he's out with his girlfriend in the woods at the start, and then he crouches down and he turns around and says, "Go away," right, and then turns into a werewolf. I mean, that go away scene is like been a nightmare in my head since I was a kid, and it was like really scarred me. But then turned me on to American Werewolf in London as well, because of the making of, which I then fell in love with as well. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely loved it. In fact, I even referenced that go away scene. There's a scene where there's a girl crawling on the floor, and she turns around, she whispers "go away," which is a direct reference to that Michael Jackson Thriller. So I loved werewolves, and when I saw this cover, I was so jealous. I wanted that cover, and so we came up with this deal that if the guy who originally came up with this idea for a book, he had a year to start it. If he hadn't started the book within a year, then the cover would fall over to me, and I would be able to write a book around it. So I waited patiently. The year went by, and the year to the day, I was like, right, has he written it? Has he written it? No, fantastic. It comes to me. So then I had this book. So I had the title, Mad Dog, and I had the cover. And the cover is, you know, it's against like a wall, and there's kind of like a graffitied blood splatter thing of like a wolf. And that was it. So I had to make a story up out of that. So I sat down and looked at it for a while, came up with a few random ideas, and the one that really stuck with me was the one about it being in a prison. I mean, the fact that you had this wall, so you had this concrete, and then with the blood splashes against it, it just kind of thought, oh, okay. So the idea of a werewolf in a prison break was, I just like the idea. And when I always come up with an idea, I'll write like a blurb, which will effectively be this is my pitch idea. And I did that with Mad Dog, and it explained about the fact that there was these brothers that were trying to escape, and they were setting this, setting a prison breakup, whilst at the same time there was this prisoner that had come into the prison, and there had been talks about him being a cannibal.
Right.
And then it says that, you know, that the prison break was going to happen on a full moon, and so that was it. That was my idea. And once I had that seed of an idea locked into place, the rest of it could kind of grow.
So is that normal practice for you? And you actually write, like, effectively you write the elevator pitch before you start the book? Is that a normal part of your planning process?
Yeah, if I can get if you can get a decent idea, which you can simply talk about it within like a couple of sentences, then it means that the idea is strong enough to turn into a story. If you've got to spend half a page trying to explain the plot, it's too convoluted in my eyes. And so therefore, you know, you're just going to end up with the sprawling mess of a book. You need to keep your ideas sharp, I always think.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about the meta narrative of my short story collection. I'm thinking you probably had a point. Let's go back to that cover art. It is astounding. It is absolutely stunning, and it sets the mood. And the other thing I noticed was that you made the decision. I mean, I'm leaping all over the place here, but in terms of the formatting, I love the fact that the cover art actually runs through the entire book. You use that image at the start of every chapter. I know that Sinister Horror Company take a lot of care over book design. I know that firsthand from the work you all put in on God Bomb and Breaking Point. Did you know early on you wanted to do that as well, or was that something you discovered in the production process? Because it does, I got to tell you, it does add something to the experience of reading the book, where this wolf keeps coming out at you every few pages. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, so throughout all of my own personal books, I always like to put what I call chapter covers. It helps to kind of separate them out, and just sort of makes each chapter a bit more kind of grandiose. And so I knew I wanted a chapter cover, and so what I did was I had the actual chapter cover design comes from the original cover, which is slightly different from the cover of the book, and you can tell that if you look at the teeth of the wolf.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as I was looking at it here. Yeah.
And so what I did was I had the original cover, and I played around in Photoshop and just took bits of it myself and pulled it around in order to create that image. So that was the chapter cover. So I had that ready to go, and then the final cover was then tweaked and redone by Vince to put that on, because like even the title at the top that says "We're all monsters inside." Originally, that title had said "Monsters don't choose sides" because it had an IRA narrative. You see.
Right. Oh, yeah, I see that. That's interesting. Yeah, but I mean, We're All Monsters on the Inside's great, and I love how that kind of. I mean, it kind of sledgehammer nails the theme of the book, although you don't realize how well it's done that until you get to the last chapter, which is just man, we'll get there. We'll keep non-spoilery. Okay, so going back to the process. So you write your elevator pitch, you've got the cover, you're raring to go. At what point do you realize that you're going to tell this story through a series of, effectively, a series of like audio snippets or interspersed with written notes? At what point did you decide it was gonna, because it's almost like, to me, it's almost like a found document in presentation. The nearest thing I can think of it that it compares to me is World War Z, which uses a similar kind of, it's like a collection of documents from a period of history. So when did that idea occur to you? Because it's a really unusual approach.
Yeah, so the idea came before I started writing it, but halfway through planning. So whilst I was, so once I've written my elevator pitch, I then like to plan the book out. I like to understand what the beats are going to be, where the plot's going to go, and so with Mad Dog, it wasn't as detailed in the fact that normally when I do plans, it's usually a page and a half to a page of A4 is kind of my notes per chapter. With this, it was kind of in smaller kind of smaller paragraphs, really, but it still had this plan. And the original plan had the story kind of how it was going to go as it is in here, but I had it from multiple viewpoints, which I realized later on I couldn't do because I needed to kind of constrain it. And then the other thing that was happening at the same time was I was reading a book by Chuck Palahniuk, the guy who's most famous for writing Fight Club.
Yeah.
Now he's written a book called Rant, and Rant is a book which I've read probably about 3 or 4 times. And on the last time of reading it was just before I was starting Mad Dog, and it's written in that style of these kind of broken up, found kind of they're like interviews with people,
right?
Kind of broken up way, and I love that book and I love that style, and I just kept thinking to myself, what a great style, what an interesting way to kind of tell a story. And I'm always the sort of person where if I really like something, I want to see if I can give it a go. And one of the things I really wanted to do was I wanted to push myself with this book. It was great doing a werewolf book, but if it was just written in a same normal way, I myself would feel like I was kind of going to get bored of it. I'd written 4 books recently. I wanted to write something in a different style. So I thought, okay, let's try that. Which, as I started to do it, it's a very interesting method because you're writing in a very different style. But from a theatrical point of view, one things that you can do is, because everyone is talking about something after the thing had happened.
Yeah.
So you can set this great amount of gravitas up about this big event and all the stuff leading up to it, and it all becomes that kind of exciting, like, well, something happened, but we're not going to tell you completely what that was just yet. We're going to slowly build you up to it, which works really well in that format.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting, because I mean, look, I adore everything about this book, but the format is definitely one of the strengths of it, because everything you've just described there. I also think that part of the reason it's, and I mean this is the highest of compliments, just to be clear, but the reason it's so damn easy to read, such a quick read, such a compelling read, is because you're actually, ironically, because of the constantly shifting viewpoints. Now, in a standard sort of third-person close narrative, that's often really jarring, really distracting, and as writers, we're advised very strongly, don't do it, right? I mean, if you've got more than one point of view character, divide it up by chapter, but you don't head hop. But because you're taking, as you describe it, this step back, because it's all post facto, suddenly it works. And I think the other thing it made me think of, I don't know if this was in your head at all, but it reminded me of, it was like watching a documentary, like a series of talking heads.
Yes.
And we've had, so I don't know if that was in your mind, but that was definitely part of the impact.
Yeah, very much. It
Right.
was that kind of, that kind of documentary effect. And it's interesting because because I was breaking up the voices. So sometimes you'll get one person saying something and then somebody saying something else, and then we'll go back to that other person and their point of view.
Mm.
You get this thing. Do you know what they call it? The Kozlov effect, where it's a thing in film where if you take a scene, just a shot, and then you for instance, a shot of like a man's face, and then the next shot you show is something different, like, I don't know, some horses in a field, and then you show the man's face again, and then you show like a baby crying. Now, what's happening there in your brain is that you are connecting those images together, and you're thinking that the way that those things are running in that guy's head, but they're actually not. They're separate things, and you can get that when you're breaking up these passages. So I would start leading you down different ways, or making the reader think different things by juxtaposition and putting these different bits of speech together. So it makes a very different effect than you would normally have from, a normal prose paragraph.
Yeah, that's yeah. I see that. And I think for me as well, one of the things I really enjoyed about it is how it let you be a bit playful with perspective as well, because you could have points where someone would say something and then the next paragraph would effectively contradict it, because you're seeing it from the other person's point of view and they have their own perspective on what happened. And there's two things that's cool about that. One is there's a kind of an immediate kind of amusement effect from that, because there's a couple where you actually land, I think, quite good gags off the back of that almost, where it's like someone says something and the other person's like says something that makes it clear that's that's not what happened. It was like this. So that's great. I mean, that just, that's just engaging and fun. But also I think what's nice is, for me, is you are in part, when you do that, you're also seeding for the reader. You are seeing, you are experiencing a series of subjective points of view. You're laying the groundwork actually for what you're doing in the novel by saying everything you hear is one voice, one perspective, and sometimes they clash, sometimes they disagree, and that is actually, it's not just realistic. I mean, that's how life really works, but it also, I think it does something for the atmosphere. Do you know what I mean? I think it helps create an atmosphere of paranoia a bit in the reader.
Yeah, it's that that unreliable narrator, but they're all the narrator, so everyone's point of view is skewed. So what story is true? And of course, this is a theme which then kind of runs throughout the book.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. One of the things I've increasingly come to is there is no such thing as a reliable narrator. I mean, I'm at that stage of my writing career and life now where that's how I see things. But obviously, this novel is, is playing with that in a very particular way. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on talking about that was the other impact that it gave me. I realized this time is it actually, that technique adds to the feeling of claustrophobia, because you don't ever escape from these very narrow perspectives. You're constantly in someone's head, hearing their direct thoughts, and also constantly jumping between. You don't get to stay comfortable in one voice for too long because you keep being shifted. And a combination of that, it creates this feeling, or it created this feeling for me anyway, this atmosphere of agitation and claustrophobia, which of course, it's a very, very claustrophobic story. Almost all of it's taking part inside the walls of this horrific environment.
Yeah, and to start with, there is that build up of paranoia. There's that collection of people that they're all kind of pressed in against each other, and something is going to blow. And then when it does blow, there's that round of confusion, isn't it? And so everyone's kind of there. So the other thing you kind of get from it is that you don't really get much of a room to breathe. There's a couple of times, like the opening chapter is like a monologue, and that eases the reader in to kind of where we're going, and sets the scene. But then after that, there's very little. There's a couple of times where I try and give a bit of breathing space, but not very much.
No, and I'm all in favour of that. I love the pacing on it. I think it's one of the key things that I enjoyed the first time, and that struck me again on this second read through. So going back to process then, so did you actually write it as it's seen? In other words, what I'm saying is, were you actually, as you wrote it, changing voices every 2 or 3 paragraphs, or did you write a chunk of a particular voice and then cut it up? Or
It was a bit of both. So there'd be times where there would be deliberate cuts in, cuts out, and I would write it within those. There'd be times where I would write, say, a bigger chunk, which I thought was going to be that chunk, and then thought, actually, do you know what? I want to cut something else into there. So it became like a little bit of an editing process. And there was time where I would agonize over exactly what order certain ones would go in and where ones would piece together, because the flow of each chapter in those voices were really important.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, and was that, I'm just, again, sorry, this is a process question, but so how was that in terms of, how much of that were you doing as you were doing your first draft? Were you actually making some of those decisions and cuts as you went through the first draft, or was that something that happened on D2 or D3?
That pretty much all of that happened on draft 1.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of with this book more than others. I did a lot of revisions within draft 1 as I was going through it.
That's really interesting.
I'd find myself going back over that chapter and making sure that was right before moving on to the next one. And in fact, actually, I mean, we kind of talk about the pacing. The book very much has a split right down the middle, which is the build up until the power cut, and then the power cut afterwards. And actually, at that point there, once I got to that point when the power all cuts off and all the doors are unlocking, I actually I stopped writing it at that point, and I had a break for probably about I don't know, probably about 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah, well, what I did was, you see, I'd been so invested in it and I'd worked so hard on it that was the point where I got to, which I think, talking with a lot of writers, they get to a point in a book where they go, I think this is bad. Yeah. And I got to that point where I was like, because you get bored of it in a sense, because you've looked at it for so much and you know all the twists and turns that are going on. And in that first point, to me, it was all about that build up and that tension and about to get to that point. And and once I got there and I'd written it, I did think to myself, is that actually going to engage a reader on the first time? And I wasn't sure. So I actually sent it off to my brother, who has been kind of like my editor and beta reader ever since I started. So we kind of know each other really well in styles. And I just got him to read it because I just had to know whether it was worth sort of carrying on. And, you know, he had other stuff going on at the time as well. And so that was fine. It gave me that distance. And so then when he came back and said, yeah, no, that's really good, carry on with it, I then carried on. But I didn't carry on until I got that green light.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I've had that happen a couple of times myself, where I've gotten to a certain stage through, and I mean, my emergency reader is my old man. I'll send it to my dad and be like, just tell me if this is a part of crap or if I should carry on.
You're so close, aren't you? You just can't really
that's right.
pick it apart to go, is this going to work for a reader now, you know?
Yeah, I do think, well, yeah, I just think at a certain point, yeah, you stop seeing it full stop. You're just blind to it because you've put that much focus on it. And I also think, I mean, especially that's interesting if you were editing as you went as well. So your brain is constantly flipping between creative and critical. I can well imagine that getting quite exhausting, actually, and getting to the point of just like, because you know, I'm at the point with my current novel draft, for example, I'm 2 weeks away from handing it over to the editor, less than that now, 10 days, and all I can see are the flaws. You know, all I can see are the bits I'm not happy with. You know, and it's that thing of like, you can't even remember how it felt when you first had the idea for the big twist, and now it's not a big twist to you. It's nothing, because you know you've read it 3 or 4 times and you've reread it. You know what I mean? So none of the good stuff lands, and all you're left with are the flaws, and it's a nightmare. And as I say, I imagine for you on this one, especially because of how you described the writing process, yeah, you must have had that throughout the first draft. If you're editing as you go, that must have been, that really was that tough? That sounds tough to me.
I mean, no, it wasn't. I mean, it took a lot of thought, you know, it had to be said, and a lot of this time was kind of done, you know, in evenings after work. So it's kind of like sections of a few hours here and there every day. but it was, but the one thing that I had was that it was challenging me, and so
Right.
if it challenged me, it was something that was interesting. It was good. I mean, the one thing I found kind of the hardest was because it's all people speaking. I couldn't do any nice, pretty, flowery prose. No
Yeah.
real descriptors. It was one of the reasons why when I went down and made the main character Jimmy into a wannabe writer, there was a
Yeah.
couple of reasons for it, but one of them, it gave me that little bit of a thing that when he's talking, he can do a couple of little bits of flowery prose because he's kind of showing off, and so
Right.
it gave me that little bit of respite to go, oh, I can do something pretty in here at least. Um,
Right, because a
yeah,
lot of your other voices are really like very kind of blue collar, like they're cops or they're prison guards or they're prisoners or they're. I mean, you've got the doctor, right? But then that's a different voice again. But it's not particularly creative, is it? The doctor's voice is a different kind of very
yes,
particular style.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And with these characters, it was. I mean, there's two things here that I. So when writing their voices, it was important to me that I wanted them to have their own characters.
Mm.
But what I didn't want to do was I didn't want to go down the route of writing dialect in.
Right. Yeah.
Because so if I used to work in a job before where I would do telephone interviews, right? And as I was doing them, I'd write down what they were saying, transcribe it. Okay.
Hmm.
And the
Hmm.
one thing you don't put dialect in, you just type what they're saying, yeah,
Yeah.
as good English. And that's how I wanted this to come out. So that became a bit of a challenge in a way of going. So the only way I'm making these characters become characters isn't through the sound, but it's by their opinions and the kind of words that they would use.
Yeah. Yeah. So suddenly word choice becomes, utterly critical, right? Because that is like that. I see what you're saying. That's like your primary differentiator between the voices at that point. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah. That's really fascinating. So I guess one of the things I'm getting from this issue is really interesting because I've noticed that's something I think we have in common as writers is that it sounds to me like actually a key part of where the inspiration for this came from was the challenge. Is that fair to say that was a big part of the motivator for you?
Yeah. I mean, it always is to me to be writing something different. It always is a
Mm.
challenge. Now, before I wrote this book, I'd had a little bit of a book hiatus and kind of like wasn't sure whether I was going to write again because I'd read an advanced copy of a book called Womb by Duncan Ralston.
Duncan, yeah.
I don't know if you've read that book at all.
I haven't read that. I read Salvage and I read his short story collection. I'm a big fan of. But I mean, I think he's a very talented writer. I'm a big fan. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of sort of came into the writing thing at the same sort of time, it seems.
Mm.
So kind of followed him along. Now, Womb is an absolutely fantastically written extreme horror novel. It's brilliant, and I read it. And I put it down, and I was so in awe of it. I just didn't think that I would bother writing again because I thought, what's the point? Do that? And so it's very rare that has ever happened. Normally I read stuff and go, oh, that's good, or I read stuff and go, God, that's terrible. I read this and it absolutely blew me away. And so when I came to Mad Dog, one of the other things that really motivated me was that book. Because I wanted to write something where basically I kind of picked it apart and looked at what is the bits that I really liked about it. And so what am I missing in my work that I can kind of feed in from there? And there was a couple of things where I went, oh, well, I like it because of this, I like it because of that, and was able to then try and channel some of that kind of idea then into Mad Dog. And when I say ideas, I don't mean things like I took its plot but it's more things like its device. So one of the things that I found interesting in the book is that it taught me something which I didn't know. So it was like, right, well, can I then put something into this book which people might not necessarily know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can I can directly relate to that. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is a new, like a live podcast show with RJ Barker, who's a fantasy writer, and we get guests on from all different kinds of writing and writing related professionals. So we've spoken to, editors and agents and people like that. We get new guests in every fortnight. But so one of the guests we spoke to is a guy called Mark Stay, and this guy's got a couple of BAFTAs under his belt for writing EastEnders. He was the showrunner of EastEnders for a decade, and he's written Casualty and stuff like that. So just this incredibly prolific writer, and clearly, obviously, very, very talented as well, but also someone working in a field outside of my experience. But the thing that he said to me that he was talking about, and this was about plotting and character, he said one of the really important things you need, and you can see how this applies to soap writing, but you can also see how it's got applications beyond that. He said it's really important that you know what your main character most wants and what they most need, and that those two things are different. Nice. And it's so simple, but as soon as you hear it, you're like, oh. And I immediately chucked it into the novel, like straight away, because I had a bit I was rewriting, quite a lengthy sequence I was rewriting because I needed to add in a new relationship to it, and it just went straight in. And that's not plagiarism, that's not stealing, you know what I mean? But it's just applying a concept. So I think, yeah, I get what you're saying. It sounds to me like it was something similar with Womb. Is that right? Where it's like,
yes,
it was okay.
Yes, it's about technique, isn't it? What is the technique kind of being used here, and what can I extrapolate out of that, which I particularly enjoyed to kind of put in, and it was that. So yeah, I mean, that book really kind of sort of pushed me to push myself that little bit further, I think.
That's the best, though, isn't it? The challenges. I love that. I love it when you read something you feel like, okay, damn it,
it's nice. I mean, there's a lot of horror books out there, at the minute. You can buy them really easy to get hold of. So people kind of say, oh, we're in a golden age of like horror literature, like lurking on the underground in this. But I only say it's only as good as is it inspiring people. If everyone's all turning around and only be inspired by your Clive Barkers and your Stephen Kings and your Shirley Jacksons, then the new stuff isn't worth anything because it's not pushing anything forward. But actually, it is inspiring people, which is fantastic.
I agree, absolutely. So I want to talk a bit more about the mechanics of this. One of the things that I was really struck by on this read was I think you did an incredible job of creating a sense of place. I talked about the claustrophobia. The vast majority of the story takes place inside the prison, and it's very, very well realized. I found myself, in spite of what you said about your struggle with not being able to use descriptive language very much because of the characters who you were giving voice to, I still think you did a really great job of evoking the prison. So, I mean, did you have like a mental map of the prison worked out in your head? Did you have the geography of it worked out in your head roughly, or was it just you just made it up on the fly as you needed it?
Yes, I mean, as I was plotting and building and then writing, I was creating what the prison was looking like. So it was all kind of there, so I could move people around into the different places. Probably do that more in the planning than I do in the actual writing, but then the writing just kind of defines it and makes that more concrete. I think with me that what helped was that before I started writing it, and as I was in the planning and plotting stages, was that I did a lot of research on prisons. So and my research was, because I couldn't go and visit a prison, but what I could do was I could watch a lot of documentaries on YouTube.
Right.
And so what I was doing is, as I was watching these documentaries, I wasn't just following what they were talking about. I was looking at everything. What does the floor look like? What does the walls look like? What are people wearing? How are the doors? How do you get in and out of the prison? What does the fences around it look? What's the light fittings? What's the kitchen look like? It was all these kind of bits and pieces that I wrote, and pages of notes, because it wasn't just, I wouldn't just absorb it. I'd actually write stuff down, and then I'd take notes, and that would spark off ideas of what could happen whilst I was doing it. And I think, in honesty, not how much of it probably came through. Probably about 10% of what I'd researched actually was probably written about. But I needed to have all of that background so I could see it in my head, because if I didn't, it would come across false.
Yeah, and I look, for what it's worth, I think that's about right. I think about 10% of it is all you want to come through, because otherwise, you always run into that danger where, I'm sure you've had the experience I have, where you read a novel, especially if it's historical, where it's set in a particular period, and you suddenly get a page of like, oh, you really read the Wikipedia entry on this, didn't you? And just wanted to nothing pulls you out of a story quicker than that. That level of kind of exposition. So I think 10% is about right. I mean, it worked for me. The thing I sort of got to was like, Darkdale Penitentiary, and it kind of reminded me of like Dartmoor. It had that kind of feeling of one of the really old, one of the like going to seed old kind of prisons, like Victorian era prisons.
Strangeways, I think it was very much
right. Okay. Yeah.
A theme. It was an inspiration when I was looking at it. That kind of sort of thing.
Cool. Yeah, I can see that. And for me, the prison's almost a character itself,
Yeah. Well, it's called Darkdale. Now, Darkdale isn't actually the name of a prison. Darkdale in itself, where I took the name from, is actually the name of a ship. A ship that got downed in the war, was sat under an ocean bed. And actually, at the time that I was writing it, it was leaking oil, and they were going in to kind of sort this wreck out, stop the oil, and then and seal it all up and take all the oil out from it. And I just love the idea of like it's the like it's seeping this darkness out. That's like the oil coming out. This is this darkness kind of coming out from it, and that was why I kind of married the two together and thought, yeah, that'll be a fun little name.
That's nice, because the other thing you've got the kind of ruined tower, haven't you? Which is, I mean, I like it because it's simultaneously a metaphor for the fact that the place is falling apart, but it's also like actually a critical part of the narrative. When you hit the second half after the power cut, that tower becomes, an integral part of how the story unfolds, and a lot of the climax happens there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a narrative on what had happened, like you say, like the prison itself, but it's also a narrative on the characters, on what's going on. It's that fragility, that it's and what's inside of there.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that's interesting for me, I mean, I've as you know, I'm a very political animal, so I've always got those antennae up. And I mean, this is not a big P political novel at all. I don't want to give that impression, but I appreciated the kind of very light touch but definite references to like, they keep cutting the funding and we keep saying we're going to do it next year and we keep not doing it. They're talking about various aspects of the prison, maintenance and stuff, and how it's just, you just get this feeling like everything's just gradually kind of going to seed. And it's almost like, again, it all feeds into this atmosphere of this is a disaster waiting to happen. Well, that's that sense of dread and foreboding that you're building really for the entire first half of the book, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I kind of sort of mentioned about that whole, it's everyone looking back. What they're doing in the first half is we're putting all the little pieces in place to what happens to make this the perfect disaster. And it's all like you say, we cut funding here. Well, why, that's part of one of the dominoes which is being lined up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of sort of, that's all really what the kind of the first part of the book is all about.
But what's fun about that is it's also very, very in character, because you've got the different perspectives. You get the different points of view on what caused the problem. And it's almost like everyone's got their own theory. And part of the fun part is it's always someone else's fault, which it always is, right? That's very, very human that people would do that. But obviously from the reader's perspective, what's starting to build in your head, it's like, okay, this is kind of a perfect storm. This is kind of, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. Shall I kick over into spoilers now then?
Yeah, we can. Oh, actually, there is something I should tell you about the first half of the book. There's a scene in it which I don't know if you picked up my inspiration from it, but the moment when Mad Dog, so Mitch Mad Dog Mooney, when he is brought into the prison and he's walking down and everyone kind of sees him, but Jimmy sees him through frosted glass and he runs over to him. Do you know what scene I was inspired by?
It's RoboCop, right?
It is RoboCop. Yeah. Absolutely. 100%. That scene is one of my favorite pieces of cinema because the build up to that is fantastic, and I just wanted to try and get that into this because it just felt right.
Yeah, it's lovely because what I like about that is that sequence in the movie. It's your first glimpse of him, and your glimpse. You don't actually see RoboCop for like, I don't know, it's like 2.5, 3 minutes. You don't fully see him. He's always first he's behind the glass, then he's in the distance, then he's behind the chain, and it's like it's a long time before you see the full kind of outfit, and it builds the atmosphere. And of course, in that sequence in the book, you're doing exactly the same thing, right? This is Mad Dog. This is the legend as he strides into the prison. So of course, there's another reason for the prosthetic glass, which we'll get into later. But even beyond that, like you're trying to recreate that atmosphere in the mind of the reader, right? That feeling of like,
Yeah.
here it comes, man. It's just like, yeah, here comes the guy.
Yeah.
No, that's superb. And that's lovely to hear as well, obviously, because greatest movie ever made. It's good to see people
Well,
pay
it won
appropriate
Oscars,
tribute.
didn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. It won every Oscar. So rightly so. So I want to get into some specifics now. One of the things that I noticed is that it's funny because I know you write extreme horror. I always kind of forget how far you're willing to go until I get there. And there's always, in any of your work I've read, there's always at least one scene, often more, but there's always at least one that really gets me. And the pool cue execution in this story is one of the vilest things I think I've ever read. It's so stomach churning, and I had unfortunately blanked it from my mind before I came back to reread it. So I got all the fun of the fair this read through again, going like, oh my god. I mean, yeah. One of the questions I had was like, is that something that you actually had to do medical research for? And if so, like, I mean, do you sleep out of interest? I'm just curious.
So, I mean, with that scene, with scenes in general, I always like to have some good set pieces within a story.
Right.
It's one of those things that then just make those sort of standout things. And I particularly in horror like to have a good, shocking water cooler moment. There's a couple in different stories, and I guess in Mad Dog, the big one is definitely that pool cue scene. Now, how that actually came about for inspiration was a friend of mine who had read my first book, Terabyte, and he was a big fan of it. And when I say a friend, he was a work colleague of mine that heard that I wrote books and then we've been working together only for a couple of months, and then he picked up Terabyte and he loved it. So it wasn't like it's someone that was invested in me along those sort of lines. And I was really chuffed with this, really made up with just how much he loved it. So when I wrote Mad Dog, when I wrote the first chapter to Mad Dog, because I spent quite a bit of time on that one just to make sure I got the tone and everything right in the way that people speak in that. And I passed it over to him to read, and he enjoyed it. And we started talking about what Mad Dog was going to be, the idea of it. And he told me that one of his relatives, it might have been his dad actually, but I can't remember his dad or his uncle, used to be a prison warden in a prison in Northern Ireland.
Right.
And the way that they used to execute people was using a pool cue and sticking it up there.
Wow. So so it's a real thing.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
Oh my god!
Because when you're in a prison, you got nowhere to actually have weapons, right?
Right.
So they would use what they kind of could.
Yeah.
And when he told me that, I was like, I was disgusted, of course, as a human being, but I'm also a horror writer, and I was like, that's going in there.
I'm having that.
It didn't take much in the way of medical research.
No,
you've only got to have a quick look at the body and the organs to work out how that's going to go. But the interesting thing about this one is that what you are reading in the book, it's never actually shown, and
no, that's
he
right.
never actually sees it. He sees what's going on in his mind.
Yeah. No, that's really, and that's back to the decision of having that particular character be a writer, isn't it? Because that's the thing about us as writers. Because that's an interesting point. Because I imagine I imagine there are people in the world for whom we'll hear, oh, you know, they've killed people in prison by sticking a pool cue up their ass, and they think, well, that's nasty. But their minds wouldn't necessarily do what your mind or my mind does, which is really kind of go into that, you know, like really pick apart. Okay, so then it's going to go right, then it's going to pierce the bowel, then it's going to end up, wow, that's really nasty, and just really kind of get the sense of that. And of course, so having that guy be a writer means his mind can do what our minds do, right? And deliver that to the reader. Like, happy Christmas.
Yeah, it gives an excuse to have that kind of those flights of imagination, and you know and think that kind of far into those kind of sort of dark areas, you know, of the place.
Yeah, it's good. And of course, the other thing you're doing is feeding in what he does get, which are noises and smell, and, you know, just that scent and sound. So he does have just enough. And then, as you say, he kind of paints the picture in his mind based on that kind of minimal impact, you know, that minimal data he's getting in. But yeah, just, I mean, it's a great scene. I mean, it's a horrible scene, but it's a great horrible scene if you feel. Really, you know, and it's also, I mean, there's the brutality of it itself, but there's also, certainly in the moment in the book, it's also about the fact that he's being made to witness it, and then of course he's made to clear it up, you know, and that's really kind of key as well, is that thing of like, it's not just a punishment for the person who's being killed, it's at least as much a punishment for the witness, you know, psychologically. And again, that's something that goes back to, like, you know, I always think about the end of Casino, and, you know, when they're beating the guys to death, and it's like, well, it's not really for them. It's not really for the guys being killed, because they're going to die anyway. The beating's really about everyone else holding a bat saying, you fuck up and you're next, right?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the real reason you do stuff like that.
Yeah, it just adds that little bit more of that psychological horror, you know?
Yeah. So it's like, it's anyway, you know, God damn you. It's really, really, really foul and brilliant piece of writing. Yeah. And I guess, I don't know. I mean, I want to get into the ending, but before I do that, the other sort of twist before that. So, reading at this time, one of the things I was thinking was the one flaw, the one problem with the otherwise brilliant approach of having everyone being talking to you about something that's happened is, and you know where this is going, none of those people can die because they're telling me the story.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental problem with this kind of storytelling. And it's funny enough, I got dinged for it a little bit. A couple of the more perceptive reviews of God Bomb said similar things. I like, you know, the one flaw in this narrative is, you know, he's not going to blow up the building because that's the end of the story and you've still got 100 pages to go. So, which is, you know, fair enough. You clever little sod, you found a way around that, didn't you?
Well, yeah. So you are exactly right. That is a problem which I encountered very early on. It's like, the people that are talking are the people that have survived this, right? So you can only get so many people that are actually speaking. And how do you connect with, you know, if you want someone, if you connect with someone before they die, it becomes a bit more kind of horrific within that thing. And I always, we're going in spoilers right now, okay? So I can talk about this.
Yeah.
So with regards to the Doctor, well, I knew the Doctor was going to go, so that's why I thought, well, let's do it as transcriptions of what they were kind of saying in writing, because also that's a kind of a thing that a doctor would do, you know. They'd be doing these kind of medical sort of things. So of course, whereas everyone else has got the actual speech, I think I actually write in it, then I like transcripted from. So you've got all this stuff actually from them, which means that then, you know, if you picked up on that early on, that would be the kind of notes go, oh, well, that's a bit different, isn't it? But then it's from a doctor, so you think, well, it's just another piece of this found footage style stuff. But then of course it gets to the end bit, or as we get closer to the end, and then we realise that, yeah, they're a goner. So yeah, it was a way to work around it. But yeah, that was one of the kind of irritating challenges, that I couldn't bump off all the people that we've grown to know and love.
But I love it, because I think what was clever about it was, you do. I mean, you didn't cheat. You did say transcripts and notes or transcripts of recordings, but it because so you gave the clue. So when you got to that moment, you couldn't feel like, oh man. But for me anyway, it still landed as a shock because the whole thing is people talking to you. So yes, you note that it's a transcript, but you don't really connect it to you. Do you know what I mean? Like your mind doesn't go, oh well, that's Theragon then. It just doesn't. Your brain doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and as your brain's going through it, once you've read the character's name a couple of times or whatever, whoever it is, your brain doesn't really read that bit so much anymore. It kind of scans over it, clocks the information, and then reads what they're saying.
Yeah, and especially because by that point you're very clued into people's voices and positions, and by that point in the narrative you're kind of invested in what they're going to tell you next. So you are going to kind of jump ahead to to the meat of what they're saying rather than worry about it. But it's just I just noted it, that's all. It was really, for me, it's one of those moments that I really enjoyed it as a reader, but I also enjoyed it as a writer. Do you know what I mean? I was like, yeah, nice one, man, that's clever.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's interesting to say about the fact of, like, you knew people's characters and you knew their positions, and you only know that through what they're saying or what other people are saying about them, as opposed to when you're writing something in third person where you can kind of explain those things. So for me, it was really important every time I was thinking about a character. I had a whole separate document that I always had up, which I wrote about the characters, who they were, what their motivations were, what their positions were, who they hated, what their backgrounds, all that kind of stuff. And even if a character came up for like a couple of lines, I'd have to make sure I put them into that document and put it up, because just in case they came back at some points, because as though I plan it, there are times where, I just want to bring this in, or that would be good if that person would come in. And I had to make sure that the continuity of character was absolutely nailed.
Yeah, I can see that, because it's really important. And it is, and because you are juggling quite a sizable cast with this one, aren't you? You've got about, what is it, like a dozen point of view characters, something like that?
Yeah, at least, if not more. And that's the thing. You had to have that many people in it, because you had to, otherwise it just becomes big monologues. The more people you got in it, the more points of views you get, so the more different points of views, and it gives you that more tension and that humor if you wanted it, that sort of thing. So it was a lot to kind of juggle, which is why there's a lot of notes having to be made.
Sure. But also, I think you're right. It's not just that; it's the way the perspectives reflect off each other to help you build a picture. That's really important, because no one. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. Like, basically, nobody sees themselves as the bad guy, right? And everyone. Also, there's the added layer of something terrible's happened. So especially when you're talking to the guards, that part of their calculation is to try and paint themselves in the best light, right?
Yes, of course, right.
Again, because everybody does, because no one thinks of themselves as the bad guy. So that's nice. So it's so important that you get those other perspectives, so that you can see what it looks like from that character's perspective, but then someone else observing that character and seeing their own version of, you know what I mean? Like, there's a few moments where that happens, and it's really important, and it helps. I mean, as well as occasionally being a good source of humor, it also helps build up your sense of what's really going on. Well,
that's the point, isn't it? The fun point is, and this is always what you want to strive for, I think, as a writer, is kind of, if you do something good by, you tell a story, but the actual story isn't the story you're telling. It's the story that the reader is going to make up by connecting the dots that you give. So you give the sum, they come up with a solution.
Yeah. And I think, that ties in. That I think the way I formulated that in the past is to say, like, that your most powerful tool as a writer by far is your reader's imagination.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
They're your secret weapon. They're the ones who, because actually they're the ones who do most of the work, if you're doing it right.
Yes.
And that's to say, that's what you're saying, right? That's exactly what you're talking about, is that you give them enough of a shape to join the dots themselves, and that act of doing that is fun. Of course, though, in your case, you're doing that for another reason as well, which is you're wanting to create a false picture so that you can pull the rug out from under them in the final chapter. So did you know that's where you were going from the beginning? I'm assuming you must have done.
Yes and no. So
interesting.
So there was a couple of different endings which first jotted into my mind when I was planning it. So when I first planned the book, originally, when he was going to go into the tower, in the end, he would actually see sprayed out on the wall, he would see "Make them pay." And the original idea, before I started writing, was that actually the incident that happened in the prison beforehand was actually Martin Powell, who is Punch from my book Punch,
Right.
is taken into prison. He then escapes prison, and this was going to be this reveal. So this book was going to be a sequel to the sequel to Punch, which I haven't written yet.
Right.
And it was
Okay.
but then when I wrote that, I thought, but as in my plotting stages, I quickly scrubbed that out because I went, do you know what? That doesn't make sense to anybody that hasn't read Punch, and
Right.
this just isn't going to work because there's much more fun I can do here. And then my initial and then I then played with the idea at one point that actually the werewolf in it was going to be Hannah, the girl from the start. Because
Okay. Yeah.
she gets attacked, right? And if
Yeah.
she's
Yeah.
attacked by a werewolf, doesn't she then become a werewolf?
Right.
So I did an idea of that was that going to be, and actually I think chapter one and start of chapter two, I'd written with that kind of in mind because there's a line which I took out, which originally Jimmy talks about the fact that he never saw Hannah when they were together. He didn't really see her that much. Once a month, she would go away to her parents, and then he'd throw in a casual like a line about like periods or something like that, because that's what he assumed that she went away for. She was a nightmare when she was having a period.
Right.
But of course, really, that was then going to be a secret nod to the fact that actually she went away for a week every month because that's when the full moon kicked
Got
in.
you. Yeah.
But then I very quickly went, no, I don't like that idea. Right, I'm going to settle on the idea that it is. And that was
Right.
whilst I was in chapter two. But I actually left that line about her going away in the goddamn period and stuff in on by the time I finished it. And when I passed it over to some my friends to beta read, one of them actually said, why is that line there? And I actually thought to myself, yeah, there is literally no point having that line in there. It almost sounds misogynistic now. There's no point to it.
Right.
So I
Right.
just took that out. It was a breadcrumb that wasn't necessary. So yeah. So in short, to start with, I had two other ideas, but the final one and the one that I definitely settled with was whilst I was working on chapter two. However, the way that the book works means that, like, as I was going through this, and I had to then go through and double check all my plotting, and I had to change a few things within this to get it right. But of course, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the book which is kind of metaphorical or isn't really happening.
Yeah, because
Sorry.
one of your because one of your principal point of view characters is unreliable even by the standards of the rest of them.
Yeah. And so there's stuff that kind of happens in there that just doesn't actually happen.
Yeah.
And so it's the point of, and so although I don't actually say which bits are happening and which bits are not actually happening,
Sure.
All that actually happens, you physically cannot actually happen. So some of it isn't real. And I had to be really clear in my mind of what was actually really happening.
Right. Yeah, of course.
So I don't think I ever I don't think I ever wrote it down, but it's very clear in my head as to what is really going on.
Yeah.
And what is really happening to spark certain things off to go on to other bits. But I had to have that in my brain, because if I didn't, I would just, it was important to me that if someone reads the book to the end and then goes back on a reread, once they get what I'm doing, they're able to pick through it and go, oh, okay, that's real, that's not, that's real. So on scrutiny, or if somebody challenged me on it, I could really talk through the book and explain it.
Well, I've given this a lot of thought. I mean, not all my stories have twists, but I love them. I think twists are a little underrated, because I think bad twists are the worst, and I think they put people off. But I think it's easy to underestimate just how beautiful a good twist can be when it really lands. And it's one of the reasons I'm still to this day very spoiler phobic when it comes to stories, and a lot of people aren't nowadays, and they're quite happy to go into a film knowing what the main beats are going to be. I don't, because I there are very few things in life that I enjoy more than a story that surprises me in a good way. You know, like for me, that's one of life's great pleasures. I'll never forget the first time watching Fight Club. You know,
Yeah.
the first time I watched The Sting. You know, any film like that, even something popcorn like Ocean's 11, right? I still think the last 20 minutes of Ocean's 11 is just glorious. Yeah, absolutely glorious. And the first time I saw him, I wanted to applaud. You know, it was just delightful. So I think for that to work, you can't cheat. You absolutely cannot cheat because your audience will hate you for it. So yeah, I mean, that was what I appreciated reading it this time, and just going through with it in mind and being like, yeah, he hasn't actually put a foot wrong. Yeah, this tracks.
That's it. If you've got a good twist, it's got to be. You got to be able to go back and look at repeat viewings. I mean, I don't want to really go into too much on it, but what was the film? Us. So that's a film that has a twist at the end. But if you go back and rewatch it, it's like, well, that doesn't hold up at all.
Yeah, unlike Get Out, which I think is phenomenal.
Which is fantastically that film. You rewatch it every time you watch it, you go, that's there because of this, because that has that because of this, and it's beautifully written, which was why Us was such a shock to me when I got to the end and went, because it was a great film all the way through. Like, really well acted, it was really well shot. It looks brilliant, great set pieces. But then we get to this twist at the end, and it's like, oh, you've just ruined the movie for me. Damn it.
I mean, I'd be more charitable and say I think Us was just trying to do something different, and it was fundamentally a different kind of movie. But I do know what you mean, and I certainly prefer Get Out of the two. I mean, I think that's an aesthetic thing. But yeah, but it is what you're saying, right? When you watch Get Out a second time, the delight is in picking up on every single clue that you missed the first time, isn't it? Being like, oh wow, yeah. So yeah, and again, I think I was just so impressed. It was a real joy reading it this week. It's been really fun going through Mad Dog again and just being like, yeah, you sneaky bastard, you really did. You really pulled it off, man. It's really good. So one of the things I actually did notice reading it this time, you used a trick, and I've seen this done in a couple of other places, not terribly often, and I have done it myself as well, where when you've got someone narrating a scene of action, the person narrating actually shifts from past tense to present tense.
Yeah, and actually I'm glad you kind of brought that one up, because that's something that when it first came out, a couple of people did kind of go, oh, you know, this isn't right. And it's like, no, that's a very conscious decision.
Yeah.
And it's something which, you know, because it was a transcript of what people were saying and I wanted to get that natural flow, you actually find when you start listening to people and how they talk. But when they're telling a story, they'll often start off in past tense and start talking about it, but then go into present tense. When they get kind of excited, you know, it kind of starts happening now and it's then and it's there. And so that was something that I really I found interesting and wanted to do. So like I said, the first monologue, the opening chapter, I probably took a couple of weeks writing that just to get that right. And it was all part of it was about getting that flow. When did it work and when didn't it work? But I think that then when you read it, you actually find that, that actually, a lot of time people read it and not even notice that I've changed tenses because it's just that flow of
right.
Speak.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, as you were saying that, the sequence I was immediately thinking of actually was probably just because I watched it recently, but Reservoir Dogs, there's a scene where Mr. Orange is doing the commode story. And he does exactly that. He starts off in past tense. And then as he gets into telling the gangsters the story about the going at the commode with the drugs and the cops that are there, he slips into present tense. And it happens very naturally because he's caught up in the moment. I mean, there's another layer to it, obviously, in Dogs, because the whole thing's a performance, right? Because he's the undercover cop and none of it's a true, like he's made the whole thing up, you know. But you're absolutely right. It's a real thing. The other places I've seen it used are, I mentioned him earlier, but R.J. Barker is a fantasy writer. He writes his fantasy novels are in past tense, except the combat sequences where he slips into present, and it creates this sense of urgency and this kind of moment of, and it works really well, you know, and it changes the tempo of what you're reading.
I mean, the present tense stuff makes everything so much more dramatic. It's so much more tense, and it's happening now. Sometimes it kind of has tendency to make it so much more angry. I mean, your God Bomb, if I remember, that's all written in present tense, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So and it just made it so much more urgent when it was kind of coming out.
Yeah, I mean, that was the reason I did it that way, was because I wanted it. I mean, absolutely everything I'm doing in that novel is with the intention of making you feel like you're in that room. That's really the experience I wanted to give to the reader, was feeling like you were stuck in that church with that lunatic and with those other people. And present tense was just one of the techniques I felt would work to help with that. I mean, the other time I used it was in a short story called Like a Charm, with a guy with PTSD, and it's told in past tense except when he's having his PTSD flashbacks. And again, then he slips into present tense, because as he describes the story, he's actually reliving it. So it's not something he's describing, it's something that is happening, present tense, as he's saying it. Do you see what I mean? So I used it. And again, funnily enough, I had the same thing. Most people didn't even notice. And people that did mainly enjoyed it. And just a couple of people sort of went, I'm not quite sure. Like, you know, I guess more technically minded readers maybe were like, well, you're sitting between tenses. But that brings us neatly on to pacing, which is the other thing I really did want to get into you with. This, so one of my favorite reading experiences is the book you can't put down because you just need to know what happens next, and a prose style that drags you along, and this is just like, this book is as good as good an example of that as I can think of. It's up there with my favorite reading experiences in that sense. It is so relentless, and it just, there's a lot going on, I think, in terms of technique that create that sense of atmosphere. So we've talked about the shifting tenses. The other thing is the constantly shifting voices that keeps you on edge. The other thing is the length of the chapters. So again, was that a conscious decision? Because I don't think you've got a chapter in here, maybe the first and the last, but very few of the chapters go over 6 or 7 pages. They're really, really tight.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm writing a book, I'm very aware of what the pace is going to be, and most of the time I like the pace to be quick, just because I have a similar taste with yourself in that kind of thing of, I enjoy books where they kind of speed along, you know, and you're like, oh, what's going on next, love it. You just get lost in it, and it's fantastic. So that's the kind of thing that I kind of want to replicate. And then, so one of the ways that I will do that is that, you know, every chapter has to have a purpose. Right. And that purpose has to be linking towards and driving towards the end goal. And particularly within Mad Dog, you've got the first half where every chapter is setting another piece up in the puzzle to get to that perfect disaster where then all hell lets loose. And so with that, and with the way that I've been writing it, and the fact that it's with people talking, you know, you're not going to get lost into flights of fancy. You're going to very much go, right, these are the bits of information or the background that I'm doing with it and the context I want to put around it that I want to put in. So you end up with pretty short chapters, and there isn't too much you then want to go into too much more detail, otherwise it becomes fluff that you just want to chop out.
Sure.
So I mean, and the way that I kind of write, interestingly, so the way I normally write is I write, and then when I go back to re-edit, I add stuff in. I'm so much a person that adds stuff in than chops stuff out, because I'm really economic with the words that I use. Now with Mad Dog, that kind of was made even more because I was pretty much editing it as I went along. I mean, I think I probably did like 4 drafts before I sent it out to people, but the difference between draft 1 and draft 4 was not going to be that much different within it. So your chapters then end up becoming pretty condensed because of the way that it's being told. And that kind of helps anyway. You know, if you get long chapters, sometimes people kind of get bogged down, whereas with a chapter, you scan through, you finish a chapter pretty quickly. Just stay for the next chapter. It's like a little trick. It's like drugs, you know. It's like just giving you that little hit. So you've broken it down. Whereas if the chapter's like 20 pages and you finish that one and the next chapter's 20 pages, you go, I ain't got time to read 20 pages. Whereas I could trick you into reading another 20 pages by making each chapter 2 pages, you know?
Yeah, and as you say, as long as there's enough happening each time, and there is, then yeah, absolutely. Because the other thing is that relentless thing of the sense of foreboding, but wanting to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the other side of it is, okay, so once the prison break is in full swing, the second half of the book. Now, I did actually get picked up and commented on this a couple of times, once through with my beta readers and once with somebody when they bought the book afterwards, is that second half they wish had kind of gone on a bit longer. Like I could have given a bit more room to breathe, and there was like kind of discussions with my brother when he was reading it on the first draft of the edit. It's like, oh, you know, you could have gone down a route of having some kind of sort of aliens kind of like stalk fest going on something in it. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I could have done. But by the time he got it back to me and I thought about it, I liked the speed of it.
Yeah.
That go in, I'd have to really break some up. And sometimes you've got to break stuff up to make it kind of refit, and that's right for it. But the speed just worked well, and it was you've effectively got kind of sort of set piece after set piece until you get to the end.
Yeah. No, I mean, for what it's worth, I think you made absolutely the right call, because I like, apart from anything else, what it does is it prevents too much chance for the outside world to really interfere, and that's a big part of it as well. Like, it keeps it contained, because for every minute that passes, you know that the wider response is going to get closer and closer, and there's not, you know what I mean? Like, whereas because it's paced as relentlessly as it is, you know, you're kind of locked in with the people you're locked in with, and I think that adds to the atmosphere as well as the pace. So I think that works. One of the other things that occurred to me is, I mean, it's interesting. You've got these different point of view characters. They're all talking after the event. You never make this explicit, but it always felt to me there was a decent chance that the entire book had been put together by a journalist who was interviewing all of the principal figures. You know, it had that kind of vibe to it. And what's interesting about that, of course, is it's very clear. And again, we talked about this before, because the shift in perspectives make it clear. Everyone's got their own agenda too. You know, everyone talking to you has their own agenda. They've got their own version of events they want you to know about. The prisoners want you to blame the guards. The guards want you to blame the prisoners, right? The armed response unit want you to blame the press, you know, but everyone's got an agenda. And weirdly, I think that adds to the pacing as well in some way, because that's the motivation of the speakers. They're not going to engage with extraneous material. They got something they want you to know. One of the fascinating things about this book is every voice feels vital. Every voice feels like it's talking directly to you and trying to get your attention and trying to, you know, tell you what happened from their perspective.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, when I went down the route, that whole idea of this feels like it's being collected by like a journalist to kind of pull it together, that it was like some really big monumental event. And there's all these talks about, you know, Mad Dog Mooney. Everybody has heard of him by the end of this, you know. So that it's the impression is that this is like some really big news that everybody has heard about. It's, you know, everybody's heard about in some way, and this is about someone almost coming in and trying to pick the detail of, so what really did happen. Everybody then is guarded. You know, nobody wants to tell. Well, everyone's going to tell their version of the truth, and that's all you're going to get. So then it's up to you to kind of pick that bit up in between. And like I say, they're almost the characters are either angry or blasé. You know, you kind of get that. There's no one is really particularly happy to sit there and talk too much with the journalist and be completely open.
Well, there's no detached neutrality either. That voice doesn't exist. Everyone's passionate about it one way or another, I think, you know, and I like that as well. Relating to the pacing, you talked about and the different perspectives. That second half is very, very cinematic as well, because one of the advantages you have with having all these different point of view characters is when you have the big action moments happen, as they do in the second half. I love how the point of view characters end up becoming almost camera angles on different aspects of what's happening. So you have these simultaneous, you've got the police up on the roof, you've got the prisoners down on the second floor, you've got the people around Mooney, and you're cutting between them to create the picture. And it really did feel very cinematic to me, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and I love that compliment. Thank you very much. One of the things that I like to do when I'm writing is, I see these in my head
Yeah,
like a film. So all those big action scenes that are going on, like even as we're talking about them now, I can see what I saw when I was writing it, locked in my brain, and and I've, I'm looking at them and I'm like, wow, that's really cool. Quick, get it down, get it down. And if I can get it down in the right way, that I can then convey in some way, in a similar way, because it never be exactly the same, but in some way
sure.
similar, that same image to you, then I've kind of done my job right. And a lot of people have said, they go, oh, Mad Dog, I'd love that to be a film. It kind of feels like that. And I'm not 100% sure how people would shoot it because there's so many different ways of going about it. But yeah, I'd love to see some of those things on the big screen.
I mean, for what it's worth, I would love to. My version of Mad Dog would be as a documentary. It would be talking heads intercut with CCTV footage from inside the prison. That's how I'd want to do it.
Oh, I like that.
I'd want to keep the format because I think it would work. I mean, I also thought it would make an amazing audiobook, like not an audiobook, like an audio play. Like, you actually get a cast of people to read the various character voices.
Yeah, now that would work because an audiobook itself I've refrained from doing because if just one person to do it and then they're constantly saying the names of the people and then it would just become, I think, repetitive and a bit hard on the ear. But if you've
Yeah.
got different people doing the voices, so it becomes like a radio documentary.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think you'd want a cast who took on the different character voices. And you could have a narrator that gave the name and occupation of each person before they started talking, because again, that's the radio format. That's how that
Yes.
works. But yeah, I think that would work really well. Yeah. Well, Justin, thanks so much for letting me bend your ear about this book. I mean, I must confess this was a little bit of a kind of writer's workshop thing for me, because it is one of those books. Ever since I read it, I've been kind of wanting to pick your brains about how you got to it, because as I say, there's so much it does that I think is really inventive and and so well executed that it's I knew I always wanted to pick your brains about it. So I appreciate you giving me the time to do that. To be honest, it's been really fun. Thank you for that.
No, thank you, Kit. Thank you very much for turning the tables on me. It's a bit weird to be answering the questions as opposed to asking them, but I really
Yes.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
No, that's all right. And I'll give you back your podcast now. And I just sorry about the mess in the corner. Just get someone in to sweep that up or something. That'll be fine. A bit of detergent, that'll come out. Don't worry about the stains.
Oh, I can't get a staff, can you?
Mad Dog by J.R. Park is available on paperback and Kindle. The Kindle can be purchased from Amazon. The paperback can be found through most book retailers, including Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and directly via the Sinister Horror Company at the website sinisterhorrorcompany.com. Thank you for listening. Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.